Caleb Branson leaned back in his office chair, staring blankly at the glowing screen in front of him. The lines of code he'd been debugging blurred together, his mind wandering to the weekend ahead. Friday evenings had always been a sacred time for him and Lydia, a small sanctuary carved out from the whirlwind of their busy lives. For years, they had made it a ritual. Take out from their favorite Thai place, a movie neither had seen, and an unspoken agreement to let the worries of the week slip away. Yet, lately, something had shifted. Lydia, with her endless to-do lists and sharp focus, had always been the planner. But over the past few months, her energy seemed to come and go like the flicker of a dim bulb. She was home less, citing work meetings or quick errands, her phone glued to her hand like a lifeline. Caleb had dismissed it at first. After all, her job as a project manager demanded flexibility. But something about the distance in her voice and the fleeting glances she gave him during dinner gnawed at him. That evening, as Caleb pulled into the driveway, the house looked as it always did, welcoming and warm, with faint light spilling out from the living room curtains. He pushed open the door, greeted by the faint hum of classical music playing from the kitchen speaker. Lydia's voice called out from the dining room, but there was a sharpness in her tone that stopped him in his tracks. "In here," she said, her voice tight. Caleb stepped into the room, his smile faltering. Lydia stood near the table, her hands nervously smoothing the hem of her gray sweater. Her auburn hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, though strands had fallen out and framed her face in a way that made her look almost fragile. Arya, their 9-year-old daughter, was nowhere in sight. "Where's Arya?" Caleb asked, setting down his keys. "At Mom's until Monday," Lydia replied, her words rushed. We need to talk." 1,000 scenarios ran through his mind, each one colliding with the other in a mess of anxiety and curiosity. He crossed the room slowly, his eyes fixed on her. "Talk about what?" Lydia gestured for him to sit, but he hesitated. Something in her expression made him feel like sitting would trap him in whatever storm she was about to unleash. "It's about us," she began, her voice steadying as she spoke. "I need you to listen carefully, and try to understand." Caleb folded his arms across his chest, his mind already grasping for meaning in her vague preamble. "Understand what?" She took a deep breath, avoiding his gaze. "I've been thinking a lot lately, about my life, about what I need to feel fulfilled." A cold weight settled in Caleb's stomach, the kind that accompanies the realization that something you took for granted might not be as unshakable as you thought. "Lydia, what are you trying to say?" When her eyes finally met his, there was no trace of the laughter or warmth he'd fallen in love with years ago. There was only resolve. "I want to explore other experiences," she said, the last word barely more than a whisper. "Other experiences?" Caleb repeated, his voice rising with disbelief. "What does that even mean?" "It's not about love," Lydia rushed to explain. "I love you, Caleb, I do, but I've reached a point where I feel like I've missed out on something. I need to understand myself better." His heart pounded in his chest as her words sank in. "You're talking about being with other men, aren't you?" She didn't answer right away, but the silence spoke louder than any words could. Caleb's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his mind racing. How could she say this so casually, as if it were a minor adjustment to their lives? "I haven't done anything yet," she said quickly, sensing his growing anger. "I'm telling you because I don't want to lie to you. I want to be honest." "Honest?" Caleb's voice cracked. "You think dropping this bomb on me is honesty? After 17 years of marriage?" Lydia's lips trembled, but she held her ground. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I need this, Caleb. I need you to try to understand." He stared at her, his throat dry and his chest aching as if someone had driven a blade straight through his ribs. This wasn't the woman he thought he knew. This was someone else entirely, a stranger standing in the same room, wearing his wife's face. Without another word, Caleb turned and left the room. The walls seemed to close in around him as he climbed the stairs, each step echoing like a gavel sealing his fate. He didn't stop until he reached their bedroom, where he sank onto the edge of the bed, his hands trembling as they buried themselves in his hair. The weekend he had been looking forward to had just become the longest 2 days of his life. The bedroom door clicked shut behind Caleb, the sound echoing in his mind like a final nail in a coffin. He stared at the floor, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of disbelief and anger. Lydia's words replayed endlessly. "I need this, Caleb. I need you to try to understand." But how could he? How could the woman he had built a life with, a woman he trusted beyond anyone else, look him in the eye and confess to needing something so destructive? Minutes felt like hours as Caleb sat motionless, his body numb except for the steady pounding of his heart. Finally, his phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling him from his stupor. It was a message from Lydia. "Please come downstairs. We need to talk more. I'm not giving up on us." The message felt like a taunt. Caleb threw the phone down and stood, pacing the room. He couldn't go back down there. Not yet. Not while the wounds were still fresh. He needed air, space, anything to escape the suffocating weight pressing down on him. Grabbing his coat, Caleb stepped into the hallway. He paused briefly outside Arya's room, the sight of her neatly made bed filling him with a pang of guilt. This wasn't just about him and Lydia anymore. Whatever came next would shatter their daughter's world, and the thought made him sick. He descended the stairs with quiet, deliberate steps, avoiding the dining room where Lydia still waited. Instead, he slipped out the front door, the cold night air biting his skin as he made his way down the driveway. "Caleb!" Lydia's voice rang out, sharp and pleading. He turned to see her standing in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. "Where are you going?" she asked, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill. "I need to think," he said curtly, his voice clipped. "Please don't walk away like this," she pleaded, stepping forward. "We can figure this out together." Caleb shook his head, his jaw tightening. "Figure out what, Lydia? How I'm supposed to accept that my wife wants to sleep with other men? Do you even hear yourself?" Her face crumpled, but Caleb didn't stay to see if the tears would follow. He turned and walked down the street, his strides purposeful and unyielding. Lydia called after him again, her voice cracking, but he didn't stop. As he rounded the corner, the familiar rhythm of his feet hitting the pavement brought a sliver of clarity. Running had always been his escape, his way of sorting through the noise in his mind. Tonight, though, it was different. Tonight he wasn't running toward clarity. He was running away from a life that suddenly felt unrecognizable. Blocks passed in a blur, the cold air stinging his lungs and face. He thought of their early days together, the way Lydia used to laugh at his terrible jokes, the way she had looked at him during their wedding vows. He thought of Arya, with her bright smile and boundless curiosity. And then he thought of Lydia's confession, her words like a dagger twisting in his chest. Finally, exhaustion forced him to stop. He found himself at a park bench, the dim glow of a nearby street lamp casting long shadows around him. Sitting down, Caleb buried his face in his hands. He didn't cry, he was too numb for that, but the ache in his chest deepened with every passing second. His phone buzzed again, breaking the silence. He didn't need to look to know it was Lydia. Ignoring it, he leaned back against the bench and stared at the sky. The stars above were faint, obscured by the city lights, but they were still there, distant and untouchable. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Arya's voice, sweet and excited, asking him about the stars during their last camping trip. "Do you think they ever feel lonely, Daddy?" she had asked, her eyes wide with wonder. At the time, he had laughed and ruffled her hair. "Stars don't get lonely, sweetheart. They're always surrounded by other stars." Now the memory felt like a cruel irony. Sitting there, alone in the night, Caleb had never felt lonelier. The sound of footsteps approached, pulling him back to the present. He glanced up to see Lydia standing a few feet away, her breath visible in the cold air. She looked at him cautiously, as if afraid he might bolt. "I'm not here to fight," she said softly, her voice trembling. I need you to know that I love you, Caleb. I always have." "Don't," he said, cutting her off. "Don't stand there and say you love me while asking for my permission to betray me. Love doesn't work that way." She flinched, but he didn't stop. "Do you even realize what you're asking of me? To sit by and watch you destroy everything we've built together?" "I don't want to destroy us," she insisted, her voice breaking. I don't know how else to explain it. This isn't about you, it's about me, about what I need to feel whole." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Caleb stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the exhaustion was too much. "I can't do this right now," he said finally, his voice hollow. "I need time, Lydia. Time to figure out what the hell any of this means." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. But Caleb couldn't bring himself to comfort her. Without another word, he stood and walked away, leaving Lydia behind in the cold. Caleb sat in his office late into the night, the glow of his laptop casting shadows across the walls. The house was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Lydia had gone to bed hours ago after a half-hearted attempt to smooth things over. Her words, empty apologies and justifications, still echoed in his mind. He hadn't responded, hadn't trusted himself to speak without exploding. Instead, he had retreated to his sanctuary, where logic and order usually reigned. Tonight, though, even the steady stream of work couldn't drown out the storm inside him. His phone buzzed on the desk, jolting him. It was a message from Simone, his sister. "You okay?" "You don't sound like yourself lately." Caleb stared at the message, his chest tightening. He couldn't bring himself to respond. How could he explain what was happening when he barely understood it himself? He pushed the phone aside and leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the corner of the desk where Lydia's phone sat. She had left it there earlier, carelessly tossing it down before heading upstairs. It wasn't like her to be so careless with her phone. It was practically glued to her hand these days. The thought nagged at him. He had always trusted her implicitly, never feeling the need to check her phone or second-guess her whereabouts. But tonight, with everything she had said, a seed of doubt had taken root, and it was growing faster than he could control. His hands moved before his mind could stop them. He picked up her phone, his heart pounding as he tapped the screen. The lock screen lit up, and to his surprise, there was no passcode. Lydia had always been meticulous about security, another small inconsistency that set his nerves on edge. Swiping open the screen, Caleb hesitated. This wasn't who he was. He had never wanted to be the kind of person who snooped or invaded someone else's privacy. But this wasn't about curiosity. It was about survival. He opened her messages first, scrolling through the recent conversations. Most were mundane. Work chats, reminders from her mother, a few messages from friends. But one thread caught his eye. The contact was listed as Dr. H, and the messages were sparse and cryptic. "Thanks for tonight. I really needed that. Let me know when you're free again." His chest tightened as he read the exchanges. Who was Dr. H? And why was Lydia thanking him for something that sounded far too personal to be professional? Caleb moved to her call log next, his fingers trembling. There it was, multiple calls to the same number, often late at night or during the hours she claimed to be running errands. A wave of nausea hit him. The pieces were falling into place, but he didn't want to believe the picture they were forming. He copied the number into his own phone, his mind racing. He didn't recognize it, but he knew someone who could help him find out who it belonged to. Caleb placed the phone back on the desk exactly as he had found it, his stomach churning. He stared at it for a long moment, willing it to explain itself, to somehow absolve Lydia of the guilt that now seemed inevitable. When his own phone buzzed again, he nearly jumped. It was another message from Simone. "I mean it, Caleb. Call me if you need anything." For the first time that night, Caleb felt a flicker of something besides despair. He couldn't fix this alone, but he also couldn't let it consume him. If there was even the slightest chance that he was wrong about Lydia, he needed to know for sure. Pushing away from the desk, Caleb grabbed his jacket and keys. The cold night air hit him like a slap as he stepped outside, but he welcomed it. It cleared his head, sharpened his focus. He wasn't running this time. He was taking the first step toward uncovering the truth. The next morning, Caleb stood in the parking lot of a coffee shop, gripping his phone as he debated the call. He had stared at Simone's number for the better part of an hour, his finger hovering over the call button. He wasn't ready to explain everything, but he also couldn't do this alone. His sister had always been the one person he could count on to stay grounded when his world felt like it was spiraling. Finally, he pressed the button and brought the phone to his ear. "Hey, Caleb," Simone's voice answered, warm but tinged with concern. I've been waiting for this call. What's going on? I need your help, he said, his voice unsteady. It's about Lydia. Something's wrong, and I don't know what to do. Tell me everything, she said immediately, her tone shifting to the calm professionalism she used with her clients. Caleb inhaled deeply and began to recount the past few days, Lydia's confession, her cryptic behavior, and the messages he had found. Simone listened without interrupting, letting him unload the chaos that had taken root in his life. When he finished, there was a long pause. He could hear her steady breathing on the other end, and he imagined her sitting in her home office processing everything he had said. Caleb, she said finally, I'm so sorry you're going through this. It's a lot. But you're doing the right thing by reaching out. You don't have to face this alone. Her words were a lifeline, but they didn't ease the ache in his chest. I don't even know where to start, he admitted. You start by figuring out the truth, Simone said firmly. You mentioned a number you found. Do you have any idea who it belongs to? No, Caleb said, glancing at the slip of paper in his hand. But I know someone who might be able to help. Who? Tim, a guy from work. He's resourceful, Caleb said, choosing his words carefully. Simone hesitated. Caleb, just promise me you'll be careful. This isn't just about catching Lydia in the act. You need to think about Aria and what kind of example you're setting. I know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I just need to know the truth, Simone, for my sanity. Then do what you need to do, she said, her tone softening. But remember, the truth can be messy. Be ready for whatever you find. They ended the call shortly after, and Caleb felt a small weight lift off his shoulders. Simone's unwavering support was exactly what he needed, even if it didn't solve anything yet. That afternoon, Caleb drove to Tim's apartment, his mind racing with doubts and questions. Tim greeted him at the door with his usual laid-back demeanor, but his expression shifted when he saw the tension on Caleb's face. What's up? Tim asked, stepping aside to let him in. I need your help, Caleb said bluntly. And I need you to keep this between us. Tim raised an eyebrow but nodded. Okay. What's going on? Caleb handed him the piece of paper with the phone number scrawled on it. I need to know who this belongs to. Tim's eyes flicked over the number before looking back at Caleb. This isn't exactly legal, you know. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important, Caleb said, his voice firm. Tim studied him for a moment, then sighed. All right, give me a day or two and I'll see what I can find. Thanks, Caleb said, relief washing over him. Tim leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms. You sure you want to do this? Once you open this door, there's no going back. I'm sure, Caleb said, though the words felt heavier than he expected. As Caleb left Tim's apartment, the cold air hit him like a slap, but it was a welcome jolt. He was one step closer to the truth, even if he wasn't sure he was ready to face it. 2 days later, Caleb was sitting in his car outside the office building, staring blankly at his phone. Tim's message had come through just minutes ago. Got something. Meet me at the diner. The drive to the diner felt both immediate and interminable, his mind cycling through worst-case scenarios. By the time he slid into the booth across from Tim, his hands were clammy with nerves. Tim pushed a manila envelope across the table, his expression grim. This is everything I could find. It's not good, Caleb. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the envelope. Tell me, he said finally, his voice low. Tim leaned back, crossing his arms. The number belongs to a guy named Harrison Tate, works in real estate, married, 2 kids. Lydia's been meeting him at a hotel about 30 minutes outside of town. I've got pictures, timestamps, the works. She's been careful, but not careful enough. Caleb's stomach churned. He didn't want to see the proof. He didn't want it to exist, but he knew he had to look. He opened the envelope and pulled out the stack of photographs. The first few were innocuous enough. Lydia walking into the hotel lobby, Harrison following a few minutes later. But as he flipped through, the images became more damning. Lydia and Harrison in the parking lot, their bodies close. A blurred shot through a window that left no room for doubt. Caleb's hands shook as he set the pictures down, the edges of his vision blurred, his pulse hammering in his ears. How long? He managed to ask. At least a few months, Tim said quietly. The hotel staff recognized her? Said she's been coming around pretty regularly. The weight of it all threatened to crush him. Months. While he had been working late, reading bedtime stories to Arya, believing in a life that was now unrecognizable, Lydia had been lying to his face. "Caleb," Tim said, his tone cautious. "I know this is a lot, but I also pulled the guy's records. He's not exactly clean. If you're thinking about doing something with this, you've got leverage." Caleb met Tim's gaze, his jaw tight. "I don't want leverage," he said. "I just want the truth." Tim nodded, his expression unreadable. "Well, now you have it." The drive home was a blur. Caleb barely registered the streets or the stoplights, his mind consumed by the images and the implications. By the time he pulled into the driveway, his anger had begun to harden into resolve. Inside, the house was quiet. Lydia was in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner. She looked up when he entered, her expression softening into a tentative smile. "You're home early," she said, her tone light. Caleb didn't respond. He set his bag down and crossed the room, the weight of the envelope still heavy in his hand. "Lydia," he said, his voice cold. She froze, the knife hovering mid-air. "What is it?" He placed the envelope on the counter between them, his eyes never leaving hers. "Open it." Her hand trembled as she set the knife down and picked up the envelope. She pulled out the photographs, her face paling with each one. "Caleb, I can explain." "Don't," he said sharply. "Don't insult me by trying to explain this away." Tears welled in her eyes, but he felt no sympathy. "You've been lying to me for months," he said, his voice shaking. "To me. To Arya. Do you even realize what you've done?" "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her voice breaking. "It was a mistake. I was—" "A mistake?" Caleb interrupted, his anger boiling over. "You don't accidentally check into a hotel with someone. You don't accidentally destroy your family." She opened her mouth to respond, but he held up a hand. "No, I'm done listening to your excuses. I don't want your explanations. I want the truth, Lydia. Why?" Her silence was deafening. She looked down at the counter, her tears falling freely now. But Caleb couldn't bring himself to care. "Get out," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "What?" she whispered, her eyes wide with shock. "You heard me. Pack a bag and leave. I can't even look at you right now." For a moment she seemed like she might argue, but then slowly she nodded. Without another word, she turned and left the room. As the front door closed behind her, Caleb sank into a chair, his head in his hands. The truth was out, but it brought no relief, only the heavy, suffocating weight of betrayal. Caleb sat at his desk, staring at the small flash drive lying on the surface. Its presence was almost mocking, a physical representation of the betrayal that had unraveled his life. On it were the photos, the timestamps, and the indisputable proof of Lydia's affair. His hands rested flat on either side of the desk as he fought against the storm of emotions swirling inside him: anger, heartbreak, and a bitter taste of humiliation. For hours he had turned the situation over in his mind. Every instinct screamed for justice, for Lydia to face the consequences of her actions. Yet amid his fury, another thought haunted him: Arya, the little girl who still ran to him every evening, who had no idea the foundation of her family was crumbling beneath her feet. He couldn't let his rage destroy her world, but he couldn't let Lydia walk away unscathed either. The soft chime of a text message broke his train of thought. It was Simone. "Are you okay?" He hesitated before replying, "I'm working on it." Her response came quickly. "Don't lose yourself in this, Caleb. Remember what's important." He set the phone down without answering. Simone's words rang true, but they did little to quiet the fire burning in his chest. Taking a deep breath, Caleb reached for the flash drive and plugged it into his laptop. A single folder opened, revealing its damning contents. He clicked through the images, each one tightening the knot in his stomach. The grainy hotel footage, the texts, Harrison's smarmy face as he held Lydia close. "This ends now," Caleb muttered under his breath, his resolve hardening. Over the next few hours, Caleb crafted his plan with meticulous precision. It wasn't enough to confront Lydia. He needed to expose her actions in a way she couldn't deny or manipulate. He downloaded video editing software and began piecing together the evidence. The result was a short but devastating compilation. Images of Lydia entering the hotel, timestamps proving her lies, and snippets of her messages to Harrison. Caleb blurred her face in every frame, not for her sake, but for Arya's. The last thing he wanted was for their daughter to one day stumble upon this and lose all respect for her mother. Once the video was complete, Caleb saved it onto several DVDs, each labeled simply, "For Your Eyes Only." He created one for Harrison's wife, another for his colleagues, and one final copy for Lydia herself. By the time he finished, the sun was beginning to rise. Caleb leaned back in his chair, exhaustion pulling at his body, but his mind remained sharp. He knew the risks of what he was about to do. He knew it might backfire, that it could blow his life apart in ways he hadn't yet considered. But the alternative, doing nothing, letting Lydia and Harrison walk away unpunished, was unbearable. That afternoon, Caleb visited the post office. He stood in line, clutching the small stack of envelopes, his heart pounding as he inched closer to the counter. When it was finally his turn, he handed them over with steady hands, his expression unreadable. "Anything fragile?" the clerk asked. "No," Caleb replied. "All right, these will be delivered by Monday." "Thank you," Caleb said, his voice firm. As he left the post office, a strange sense of calm settled over him. The wheels were in motion now, and there was no turning back. He didn't know what Lydia's reaction would be, but part of him didn't care. She had made her choices. Now she would face the consequences. When Caleb returned home, the house was quiet. Lydia was in the living room, her phone in hand. She glanced up when he entered, her expression cautious. "Where have you been?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. "Just running errands," Caleb said evenly, walking past her. She didn't press further, but Caleb could feel her eyes on him as he climbed the stairs to his office. Closing the door behind him, he sat down and stared at the blank wall ahead. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of control, a sense that he was no longer at the mercy of Lydia's lies. Whatever came next, he was ready. The fallout began on a Monday morning, a deceptively calm start to a week that would shatter lives. Caleb sat at his desk, refreshing his inbox repeatedly as though the confirmations of his plan's success might appear there. He didn't have to wait long. By mid-morning, his phone buzzed, a text from Tim. "You've stirred the hornet's nest, man. Better brace yourself." The word sent a shiver down Caleb's spine, but he replied simply, "Good." Across town, Harrison Tate's world was beginning to crumble. The DVD had landed squarely in the hands of his wife, Melissa, that morning, wrapped in an unassuming envelope with no return address. She had hesitated before playing it, curiosity battling with the uneasy knot in her stomach. But as the grainy footage flickered onto the screen, the truth hit her like a physical blow. By noon, Melissa had stormed into Harrison's office, the DVD clutched in her hand and fury radiating off her in waves. Her voice echoed through the building as she demanded answers, drawing the attention of his colleagues and clients alike. "You lied to me, to our kids!" she screamed, her voice breaking. Harrison stammered, his face pale and his hands raised in a futile attempt to calm her. "Melissa, please, let's talk about this at home." "Home?" she spat, her voice venomous. "There is no home anymore, Harrison. You destroyed it." Word of the incident spread quickly, and by the end of the day, Harrison's reputation was in tatters. His colleagues whispered behind his back, his clients canceled meetings, and his phone buzzed relentlessly with messages he didn't dare answer. Meanwhile, at their own home, Lydia was unraveling. The phone calls began early that morning, first from her closest friend, then from Melissa herself. The accusations were sharp and unforgiving, leaving no room for denial. "How could you do this?" Melissa had hissed. "You came into my home. You smiled at my kids, and all the while you were sneaking around with my husband." Lydia had tried to respond, but her words stumbled over themselves, her voice drowned out by Melissa's rage. When the line finally went dead, Lydia sank to the floor, her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe. By the time Caleb returned home that evening, Lydia was sitting on the couch, her face pale and her eyes rimmed with red. She didn't look up as he walked in, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. "You sent them the video?" she said quietly, her voice barely audible. Caleb dropped his keys onto the counter, his expression cold. "They deserve to know." Her head snapped up, her eyes blazing with a mix of anger and desperation. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Melissa called me this morning. She's threatening to ruin me at work. Harrison's life is falling apart, and Arya—" "Don't!" Caleb interrupted sharply, his voice cutting through hers like a blade. "Don't you dare bring Arya into this. You did this, Lydia, not me." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she tried to hold his gaze. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered. Caleb's laugh was bitter, devoid of humor. "What did you think would happen? That you could sneak around behind my back, behind their backs, and there'd be no consequences?" "I made a mistake," she said, her voice trembling. "No," he said, his tone icy. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. What you did was a choice. Repeated choices." Silence fell between them, heavy and suffocating. Lydia's tears continued to fall, but Caleb felt no urge to comfort her. The woman sitting before him was a stranger, a shadow of the person he had once loved. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happens now?" Caleb stared at her, the weight of the question settling over him. "Now," he said slowly, "we figure out how to tell Arya, and after that, you figure out how to live with what you've done." Lydia nodded numbly, her shoulders slumping as though the fight had drained out of her. As Caleb turned and walked toward the stairs, his mind raced. The fallout had begun, but he knew this was only the beginning. There would be more calls, more confrontations, more pain, but for the first time in weeks he felt a sense of clarity. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The silence between Caleb and Lydia stretched over the following days, thick and impenetrable. Every interaction was stripped to bare essentials, questions about dinner, updates about Arya's school schedule, but the unspoken truth hung in the air like a ghost neither of them could exorcise. Caleb spent most of his time in the office, retreating to the space that had become his fortress. He avoided Lydia whenever possible, and when their paths did cross, he could see the guilt etched into her face. She had stopped trying to explain herself, as if finally realizing that no explanation could repair what she had broken. One evening, as Caleb sat at the kitchen table flipping through legal documents, Lydia appeared in the doorway. Her presence was tentative, her shoulders hunched as though she were bracing for a blow. "Caleb," she said softly, "can we talk?" He didn't look up. "About what?" "About us," she said, stepping closer. "About what happens next?" The words brought a bitter taste to his mouth. He set the papers down and leaned back in his chair, meeting her gaze with cold detachment. "There is no us, Lydia. There hasn't been for a long time. You just didn't care enough to notice." Her face crumpled, but he pressed on. "What exactly do you want to talk about? How you threw away 17 years? How you lied to me every single day for months?" "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice breaking. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" Caleb repeated, his voice rising. "You made deliberate choices, Lydia. Every time you walked into that hotel, every time you lied about where you were, you chose this." "I know," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "And I hate myself for it. I hate what I've done to you, to Arya, to our family. But Caleb, I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose what we have." Caleb stared at her, his chest tightening with a mix of anger and sadness. "What we had is gone," he said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "You killed it the moment you decided I wasn't enough for you." Lydia sank into the chair across from him, her hands trembling as she wiped at her tears. "I'll do anything to fix this," she said. "I'll go to therapy. I'll quit my job if that's what it takes. Please, Caleb, please don't give up on us." He closed his eyes, his mind racing with memories of their life together. The laughter, the arguments, the moments of quiet contentment. He had loved her once, more deeply than he had ever thought possible. But now, all he felt was an emptiness that no amount of effort could fill. "It's too late," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't just break my trust, Lydia. You broke me, and I can't come back from that." Her sobs filled the room, but Caleb remained unmoved. He had spent too many nights crying alone, too many days pretending everything was fine. He had nothing left to give her. The next morning, Caleb called his lawyer to finalize the divorce proceedings. He made it clear that he wanted Arya to stay with him, though he was willing to allow Lydia generous visitation rights. The house would go to Lydia. He had no desire to stay in a place that now felt tainted by betrayal. When he told Lydia about his decision, she didn't argue. She simply nodded, her face pale and her eyes hollow. It was as though she had accepted the inevitability of it all, even if it shattered her. A week later, Caleb and Arya packed their belongings and moved into a small but cozy apartment across town. He decorated Arya's room with her favorite colors, filling it with books and toys to make it feel like home. As they settled into their new life, Caleb felt a strange mix of relief and grief. He had lost the woman he once loved, but he had gained something far more important: clarity. He knew who he was now, what he valued, and what he would never tolerate again. For the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe. The weeks turned into months, and Caleb began piecing his life back together. His new apartment, though smaller than the house he had shared with Lydia, was becoming a sanctuary. Every corner bore the marks of a fresh start, a clean slate for him and Arya. He focused on creating a space where Arya felt safe and loved. Her room was her favorite part of their new home, painted in soft lavender and adorned with fairy lights strung above her bed. She had adjusted quicker than Caleb expected, her resilience a source of both pride and heartbreak. One evening, as Caleb cooked dinner, Arya sat at the kitchen table drawing pictures of the two of them. She held up a crayon portrait of a smiling father and daughter standing under a rainbow. "Look, Daddy, it's us!" Caleb's chest tightened as he looked at the picture. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. I'm going to hang it on the fridge." Arya grinned, her face lighting up with the unburdened joy of childhood. Caleb envied her ability to find happiness despite the upheaval, and he promised himself he would do everything in his power to keep that smile intact. His phone buzzed on the counter, pulling his attention away. It was a text from Lydia. "Can I pick up Arya tomorrow after school?" Her messages had become routine, practical, concise, and devoid of the warmth they once carried. Caleb stared at the screen for a moment before typing a quick reply. Sure. He didn't feel the sting of her name the way he used to. Time had dulled the edges of his pain, replacing it with a quiet acceptance. He didn't hate Lydia. Hating her would have given her actions more power than they deserved. Instead, he felt a sense of detachment, as though the chapter of their life together belonged to someone else entirely. After dinner, Caleb tucked Arya into bed and sat in his office, staring at the blank screen of his laptop. He had been toying with the idea of starting a journal, not to dwell on the past, but to document his journey forward. He opened a new document and hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keys. Finally, he began to type. "This isn't the story I thought I'd be writing, but maybe it's the story I needed to live. Loss has a way of stripping us down to our core, showing us who we really are when there's nothing left to hide behind. And in the end, it's not the loss that defines us. It's what we do with what remains." The words flowed easily after that, each one a small act of reclamation. Caleb wasn't writing for anyone but himself, and that made it all the more freeing. The next day, as he dropped Arya off at school, she hugged him tightly before running off to join her friends. Caleb watched her go, a mix of pride and bittersweet longing swelling in his chest. He spent the afternoon catching up on work and returned to the school just as the final bell rang. Arya bounded out of the building, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, and ran straight into Lydia's waiting arms. Caleb stood back, watching the interaction with a neutral expression. Lydia looked up and met his gaze, her eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place. Regret, perhaps, or gratitude. "Thanks for letting me have her tonight," she said as Arya climbed into the back seat of her car. Caleb nodded. "Have a good evening." As they drove away, he felt a strange sense of closure. Lydia's role in his life had changed, but she was still Arya's mother, and that meant they would always be connected in some way. That night, Caleb sat on the couch, flipping through the pages of a book he hadn't touched in years. The apartment was quiet, but it was a peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that felt like the beginning of something new. He thought about the life he was building, not just for Arya, but for himself. It wasn't the life he had planned, but maybe that was okay. Sometimes the best chapters are the ones we never see coming. What do you think of Caleb and Lydia's story? From which region are you watching this video? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to stay updated on all our stories. And be sure to check out more heartwarming and thought-provoking tales by clicking here on the end screen. See you in the next video.